I'm excited today to have Nick Harris with us. He was my pastor growing up, and I was able to be on staff with him. He's my father-in-law, grandfather to our kids, and so he's going to talk to us today about some stories from ministry, because over the years, how long have you been in ministry?
About 62 now.
62 years pastoring a variety of churches.
Right.
The bulk of that was at Ovilla Road Baptist Church here in Ovilla, but other churches in other cities, some Memphis, Tennessee, Mississippi area.
Right.
And then a few very local around this area from before that. But over 62 years, a lot of experience.
That's for sure.
A lot of stories, and some of them funny stories. So just tell us some stories that have happened in ministry. And I know you're not going to use names.
No.
Not that anybody's going to even know who they were anyway, because most of them maybe are from past.
Yeah.
But just have at it. Tell us some stories.
Well, let me just say, first of all, that ministry is a mixed bag.
True.
There's a lot of tears, but there's also a lot of laughter. I've preached probably close to 1,000 funerals over the 62 years. And one church I went to, the first 3 weeks I was there, I had like 8 funerals. In fact, some of them thought I had come to bury the church, you know. So a lot of funerals, certainly a lot of sick beds, a lot of children sick, and things like that. But mixed in with that, I guess God does this enough to keep us sane, you know. And if all I had was the heavy part, it'd probably just be too much. And so God allows some funny things to come along. And so I'll try to relate some of those today. I started pastoring when I was just a freshman in college. I was just 18 years old.
Okay.
And the First Baptist Church in Jackson, Tennessee, had a little mission down in really a poor section of town, and they wanted me to be the pastor of that mission. South Royal Baptist Mission was the name of it.
They wanted an 18-year-old to come be the pastor.
That's amazing. You know? And what really amazes me is that the people there were probably 30 people that attended, and they welcomed me.
Wow.
And of course, I didn't know anything. I hadn't been saved but a few months really, and I began to preach there, and I preached my testimony the first Sunday I was there, and that was pretty easy. Yeah. And then the second Sunday, I kind of rehashed my testimony again. I added some things I'd left out. By the third Sunday, I thought, I've got to come up with something new. So thankfully, Billy Graham had written some books. And so I began to look through Peace with God and things like that. And I didn't know how to prepare a sermon or anything, you know. I hadn't had any classes. I hadn't had any courses. So, but I just began to kind of speak from my heart, really, more than anything else. Yeah. And I'd take a passage of scripture. I had no idea what it meant sometimes, but I'd take simple passages like John 3:16 that you don't have to do a lot of study to get. And so while I was there was a teenage girl. Of course, I was single at this time. There was a teenage girl, not real attractive, but she kind of got a crush on me. Okay. And it was pretty clear to me that she had a crush on me. And so she would, every time she would walk by in front of me, she would faint, and she would fall backwards so I could catch her, and then she would kind of snuggle up in my arms, you know, and so I thought, well, this is not good. And that happened about 7 or 8 times.
And this is not her being slain in the spirit.
No,
because you're in Assembly's church or
that's
something.
Right. No. And I don't think it was my powerful aura or anything like that. She just, and so I decided one day this has got to stop. And so she walked by, and she started falling backwards, and I just moved out of the way, and I didn't catch her. And we had just chairs, you know, and we didn't have pews or anything like that. And she hit those chairs, and they just scattered like bowling pins, you know. And I did help her up, but she never fainted again. So that was my first experience of healing someone of a fainting disease. Wow. And so that worked out well. Yeah. And by the way, while I was there, Of course, this was back in the early 60s.
Okay.
And there was no integration in any of the churches. None of the churches had mixed congregations.
Wow.
But we were in a very, very poor section of town, and there were a lot of African Americans in our area. And there were some of them that came and actually stood on the porch of this little, we were just a little, it wasn't a church building. It was just a storefront.
Really?
And they would stand on the porch and listen to me preach. And one day it was raining and the wind was blowing. They were getting wet. And I just asked my little congregation, would it be okay if they came in and sat down?
Yeah.
And these people didn't mind. They were
right.
They were very, very poor. They'd probably been discriminated against themselves. And
Yeah.
so we welcomed them in. And for a couple of Sundays, they would come in and sit in the back, and they would listen, and they would amen, and seem to be growing. But I got a phone call from the pastor of the church, the First Baptist Church, and they called me in and said, we had heard that you were having black people in your service. And I said, yes. And I thought they were going to be excited.
Yeah.
But they were far from excited. In fact, they told me that if I allowed them to come back anymore, I would have to be dismissed. And so I told them, I can't tell people they can't come.
Right.
And they said, well, then you'll have to go. And so that was my last Sunday. They did allow me to preach one more Sunday just to tell everybody goodbye. And so that was the first of many, many experiences that related to the racial struggle in the South.
Right.
And when God had saved me, the thing that he did, the most dramatic thing that he did was just fill me with love. And that love didn't have a color boundary or a racial boundary or economic boundary. And so for the first probably 20 years that I was in the ministry, it was a continuous struggle as I would preach on the importance of loving all people.
Yeah.
And I was actually asked to leave 2 different churches after that because of my
Your
wanting
stance on
to
that,
include all people. So,
Wow.
so anyway, I pastored that little church for about a year. And then after they dismissed me, a church in Humboldt, Tennessee called me, which was another interesting experience. This was a church that had made up of people who had been kicked out of another church
Wow.
because they were such troublemakers. And they had gone to try to join 2 or 3 other churches, and nobody would let them join.
Wow.
And they just had that kind of reputation. And so they just formed their own church. And they said they needed a pastor, so they contacted the school. I was going to Union University, and they contacted the school and said, we're looking for a pastor. And they knew at the school that I had just been dismissed from this other church. So they gave them my name, and I went over and preached. And they were meeting in a tin shop, shop that made air conditioning ducts and things like that.
Right.
So I preached, and then I came back and talked to one of my professors, and I said, they want me to come and be the pastor. And he said, well, I know about these people. He said, they've got a reputation throughout the county. He said, you would have to be a fool to go and accept that church. So that kind of seemed like a challenge to me.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I think I'll do that. So I accepted it.
Yep.
And my first official Sunday, right across from the tin shop was a motel. And on the marquee of the motel, it said, welcome, fool. And I took that as an unusual sign.
Yeah.
I found out later that it actually said, welcome, pool.
Oh, boy.
But someone had thrown a rock up and broken the hump off of the P, and so it looked like an F instead of a P. So, so I will say that I had a lot of interesting experiences there, but I was there for 3 years, and how I survived 3 years, I don't know. It was the most fighting church.
Wow.
They loved business meetings. They shouldn't have called them business meetings. They should have called them boxing meetings or something, because they fought about everything. And while I was there, we built a new building. And I said,
out of the tin shop.
Yeah, out of the tin shop. Moved out of the tin shop. We built a new little building. And then they'd put a sign out front that said the name of the church and said, everyone welcome, which was not true, of course. And then said the friendliest church, friendliest church in town. And then they had to decide if they were going to, they wanted some lights to shine on the sign. And so one of the deacons said, well, we need to put the lights down on the ground so they can shine up on the sign. Well, one of the other deacons just had a fit and said, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. Said, we'll have to mow around those lights and they'll get water in them, and the kids will be roasting frogs on them, all kinds of stuff, you know. Said, we need to put the lights up on the church and let them shine down on the sign. And then this first guy, he had a fit, and he said, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. We'll have to climb up on the roof to change the lights. Somebody will fall off and break their back. And and I'm just sitting there thinking, this is, and then they got in a really, almost a fist fight over it, you know, and this guy had people taking his side. This guy had people taking his side. So I finally, of course, I'm just 20 years old this time, maybe 21, and I slapped the table, and I said, wait a minute. I said, I have an idea. I said, why don't we just take down the sign? Because it's not telling the truth anyway. This is not the friendliest church in town, and we don't even need lights on it. And I succeeded in unifying the deacon body. They all turned against me.
Wow.
And so we actually, they ended up putting lights in both places. And so nobody had to lose. And so anyway.
Except the community.
Except the community. That's right. So that was an interesting time. And then then I went from there. I left there. I actually resigned and went to a little church out in Medina, Tennessee. And it was 2 years, just two of the sweetest years. I married while I was at that first church, that other church.
Yeah.
And so Carol and I, we were newlyweds, and I thought we were going to go to seminary. We actually were going to go to Southern Seminary up in Louisville, Kentucky, but the Lord just shut the door on that, and we decided we'd just not go to seminary for a while. And so then I got called to Latham's Chapel Baptist Church. And our first baby was born while I was there. Yeah. And it was just a sweet time. We were like everybody's grandchildren, you know.
So it was an older congregation.
An older congregation. Country congregation.
Wow.
And every day during the fall, we'd have vegetables sitting on our porch. And sometimes a ham or something like that. And just a sweet time. And I also was teaching school during that time. The school in Medina had an opening for a teacher, and they asked me if I would teach, and I did. I loved it. I taught 7th grade math and 8th grade English and 10th grade science and economics. I taught a bunch of stuff.
All of it.
And I loved it. And many of the kids in that school came to know Jesus while I was there that year. And I still stay in touch with some of them. That's been almost 60 years ago.
Yeah. Wow.
And so I felt the Lord urging me to go to seminary. So we moved to Texas. We moved out here, went to Southwestern Seminary over in Fort Worth. And had a wonderful 4 years there.
Yep.
The first 2 years were very, very hard. I was working 3 jobs, and pastoring a little tiny church up in Leonard, Texas. It's 100 miles from Fort Worth, and it was just a very, very challenging time for us. And also during that time, we had another baby. Our son was born. And then after 2 years of struggle there, we got called to Daniel Dale Baptist Church up here in Dallas. In fact, if you're coming from the south on I-35, I think it was 77 at that time, but it became I-35. Just as you entered the city limits of Dallas, it was the very first building.
Right off of the I-20, I-35.
That's right. So I used to tell people I pastored the First Baptist Church in Dallas. If you're coming from the south on I-35, and nice. But we had a wonderful ministry there. Mostly, I was really mostly the youth pastor.
Okay.
Who was just called the pastor. They didn't have youth pastors back then, and we had I can't even guess how many. Dozens of teenagers we had that came to know Jesus that was during the Jesus Revolution, by the way. That was right at that period of time, the early 70s. And it was an amazing time, a spiritual renewal. Right. And we made many friends there that we've stayed friends with for all these many years.
Now, this is the church where you meet a man named Mr. Panther.
Mr. Panther, yeah.
Talk about Mr. Panther.
When I was called to that church, the night they voted on, they asked me, they said, we're going to vote. And so they asked me to go back, me and Carol go back in the back. And so while they voted, and then somebody came and got us and said, well, you're in. You've been voted in. So we came back out, and everybody was going to come around and shake my hand, and everybody was shaking my hand, saying, welcome as our new pastor. I was 26 years old this time. And but this one man came by, and I put my hand out, and he put his hands back behind him, and he just kind of glared at me, and his name was Mr. Panther. And he said, I voted against you. I didn't know exactly what to say to that. And he said, do you want to know why? I said, I guess. He said, because you're too young. And I said, well, you'll like me better next week. I'll be older. And I thought that was kind of funny.
That is clever.
But he didn't think it was funny at all. And he just kind of huffed, and off he went. And that started a 1 year continual battle between me and Mr. Panther. Whew. And he was one of my deacons.
Oh, my.
And he had been a carnival barker for years. He and his wife had both worked in the carnival.
Okay.
She was actually a gypsy palm reader, fortune teller kind of person, all fake, of course.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
And he was one of the ones that worked on the Midway.
Wow.
And he just didn't like me. And honestly, I didn't like him either.
Yeah.
And so one August, just about almost this time of year, it was so hot. We can identify with that.
Yep.
And I got a phone call. I didn't tell you, Mr. Panther lived right behind the church.
Oh, my.
So he loved to kind of keep tabs on me, what
Watching.
time I came to work and when I left, things like that. But this woman called, and she said, our refrigerator's gone out, and I need desperately a refrigerator. We have 2 small children. Their milk was sour. I said, well, we actually have a refrigerator here at the church that we're not using. And I probably should have called somebody. I should have called a deacon or somebody, but I called one of the men who had a truck, and we took it over. They just lived across the street, really, just across the interstate. And we took the refrigerator over there, and I walked into the house, and went back home, and I walked into my home, and I was sweating because it had been hot. And I felt good, though, that we had helped somebody.
Done a good thing.
And my phone was ringing, and I answered it, and it was Mr. Panther. And he never called me preacher or Pastor Nick. He always called me creature. So I answered the phone. He said, creature, Who gave you the authority to give away our refrigerator? And I don't know. I don't usually lose my temper, but I did. And I just yelled at him. And I said, Mr. Panther, I've just had it with you. I said, if you had 1 ounce of the love of Jesus in you, you wouldn't treat me the way you do. And I just went on. And then I just hung up the phone. And my wife,
very unlike you.
My wife standing there with her mouth open. She had never seen me behave like that.
Yeah.
And so the phone rang again, and I picked it up, and he said, "Don't you ever hang up on me." And then he hung up on me. So I grabbed the phone and called him back. He said, "Hello," and I just hung up on him. Real mature,
Of course. Yeah.
And so then the phone started ringing again. I wouldn't touch it. I told
Wow.
Carol, let it ring. Of course, it's back before anything else. Just
caller
phones
ID
ring.
or anything. Yeah.
So just so happened that the next day, actually, this was on a Saturday, and the next day I was preaching on, no man anything except to love one another. And I had the teenagers make a bunch of little flowers, and as the invitation, I said, after I preached my sermon, I said, now I want all the husbands to come and get a flower and take it to your wife. And just tell them that you love them. And they did, and it was sweet. And I said, now I want the kids to come get a flower, take it to your parents. They did, and that was sweet. And there were still some flowers left. So I got this idea. I got up on my right elbow and kind of had my finger pointing right over to where Mr. Panther was sitting. And I said, now, I'm just going to see who will be obedient to God. And I said, if you have been contrary, and if you've hurt somebody, and if you've just been resistant, and I just spelled it out,
Yep.
And I said, I'm going to see will you come and pick up a flower and take it to the person that you've offended and ask their forgiveness. And then something happened. The Holy Spirit spoke directly to my heart and said, you need to take a flower to Mr. Panther. And I'm very much not accustomed to saying no to the Spirit. But I said, Lord, I thought you were a better shot than that. I don't know, somehow or another you were aiming over there and it ricocheted over here. And I said, you need, I can't do it. But our song leader would not stop the invitation. And I turned, and you know how you let them know, he next verse, he just sang again. And he did that for 4 or 5 more verses. And it just dawned on me that we're going to be here until I obey what God's telling me to do. So I came down from the pulpit. I picked up a flower and took it over to Mr. Panther. And as I got close to him, he had his head down when I started walking toward him. But when he raised his eyes up and saw me standing there just a few feet from him, walking toward him, he kind of braced himself like I was coming to fight or something. But I handed him the flower. And I said, Mr. Panther, will you forgive me? And our hearts just broke, mine and his. And I reached out to hug him. I figured he'd pull away, but he embraced me. And we just stood there and wept.
That's amazing.
It's hard for me to even tell you.
Yeah.
But we just wept, and God just did an amazing thing. And then after that, we just had the most glorious outbreak of the Spirit of God in our church. We had, I think the very next week, we had like 13 young people who were saved on one Sunday. And Mr. Panther became one of my closest friends. And in fact, later that day, he called me, and he said, Brother Nick.
He didn't
First
say
time
creature.
He'd ever called me Brother Nick. He said, would you come to my house? He said, I have something for you. And I went over to the little house that he lived in behind the church, and he had a FINA credit card. I didn't even know what a credit card was. FINA was a gas station back in those days. And he said, I want to give you this FINA card, and said, if you're ever out and your car breaks down, or you need gas, you can use it. And I carried that card with me for years, and I never used it, never had to use it.
Wow.
And years later, when he died,
Yeah.
He had left instruction wherever I was. He wanted me to preach his funeral.
Oh, my goodness.
And I went and preached Mr. Panther's funeral.
Ooh.
So
Well,
that
that's
was
a great,
powerful,
great story.
powerful lesson for me.
Yeah.
That sometimes when the preacher is trying to get people to respond to God, it may be him that's needing to respond.
That God's speaking to. Wow.
So we had a wonderful time there at Daniel Dale, and then I got a call to the First Baptist Church in Halls, Tennessee. I left Daniel Dale, much to the disappointment of many of our people that we love, but it was back in Tennessee. My parents lived in Tennessee, and so we moved back to Halls, and I was there for 3.5 years. Had a wonderful, wonderful ministry there. Again, this was kind of still follow up on the Jesus Revolution.
Right.
We had a lot of hippie kids that got saved in that, and it was a sophisticated church. Why they ever called me, I had no idea. But I mean, the women wore mink stoles to church. It was incredible. I was not accustomed to anything like that.
Wow.
But we had. We reached lots of teenagers.
So this sounds like in the movie Jesus Revolution, where there's a church and the hippies come in, and that kind of was your experience there as well?
It was. And I will say that we didn't have as much negative reaction. We had some. We had especially some of the older ladies that were more prim and proper, who just didn't like kids coming to church barefooted and
long hair
and things like that. And but I remember one night I was preaching, and one of those hippie boys, long hair, just and he was sitting on about the third row back, and I was preaching about the judgment seat of Christ and how that someday we'll stand before Jesus and we'll give an account for the things we've done in the flesh. And he just got under such conviction. He couldn't get out. He was kind of boxed in. So he got up and walked across the top of the pews and just dived down to the front. And again, we had a great response. There are so many young people came to the Lord there, and many things. I'm thinking of so many. So but I tell you, something that really doesn't have to do with ministry. But it was the funniest thing, I think, that ever happened to me.
Okay.
While I was pastoring there in Halls, I would go to Memphis, which was about 60, 70 miles south of Halls.
Okay.
And I would have to drive through Millington, Tennessee, and the car I had was not air conditioned. And
I'm just remembering the story.
And I had didn't even have a radio in the car, but I had a little portable tape player, and I would get tapes from different people. Some folks not even going to know what tape players are.
Yeah.
But
and it's cassette tapes.
Cassette tapes, yeah. And I'd put a cassette tape in there, and I love to listen to preaching.
Sure.
And I like a lot of different styles of preaching, but I was listening to one of these, I call them Tennessee windsuckers, boy. I mean, they are vicious. And they were just yell and scream, but I like to hear that sometimes too. And,
sure.
And I was driving, my windows down, of course, my tape player laying in my seat.
Right.
And that preacher was preaching, and he said, you can deny the Bible. You can deny that there's a God. But I'll tell you what else you can do. And just at that moment, I pulled to a red light in Millington.
Right.
And I stopped right beside a guy who his window was down.
Okay.
And I looked over at him. He looked at me. And then this preacher yelled, you can go to hell.
Wow.
And that man thought it was me. And then the preacher didn't say anything else for the longest time. So I thought, I've got to let this guy know that I'm listening to a tape.
Oh,
and
man.
so I'm pointing
down,
pointing down at the tape player, and the man thought I was not only telling him where to go, I was actually showing him the direction.
Wow!
And he started getting out of his car.
Oh,
and the light turned green, and I took off.
Shoo.
So I don't know. I'm sure that man had some tales to tell when he got home.
Exactly.
Yeah. And thankfully, I didn't have a fish on the back of my car or honk if you love Jesus or something.
And he didn't catch
so
you.
he
or
didn't
anything.
know that I was.
Wow.
So that was probably the most embarrassing thing
That's
that ever
hilarious.
happened to me. And,
yeah.
But I had a great time there at Halls. We had, and still have. I've gone back to Halls even after 50 years. I've gone back to preach funerals for people that were dear to us, and there were many who were very dear to us during that time. And then when I left Halls, I went to North Mississippi, just barely across the state line.
Okay.
And I pastored a church in Horn Lake, Mississippi.
Okay.
For 7.5 years. And we had a good ministry there. And of course, by this time, our third daughter was born. Heather was born. That's while we were in Halls. And so we moved to Mississippi. I'd always said I would never live in Mississippi, but I've learned that don't ever tell God what you won't do.
Not going to do, yeah.
But we actually had a real good ministry there for 7.5 years. And then I got called to Ovilla.
Okay.
And that was 40 years ago.
That's
41
crazy.
years ago.
Now, where along the way was a lady named Miss Looney?
That was in Mississippi too.
Okay.
That was at Horn Lake. Yeah,
Okay.
That's one reason we left Horn Lake. By the way,
Okay.
there was this woman. My mother lived in some apartments not too far from the church up in South Haven, and I would go up and do a Bible study with. It was kind of a retirement community.
Okay.
And there was this woman there, and people think I'm making it up, but her name really was Ruth Looney.
Mm-hmm.
And Miss Looney just loved to hear me preach, and she just fell in love with me.
Okay.
Unfortunately, she literally fell in love with me.
Oh.
And
she's older.
She was older. Oh yeah, she was probably 70. And,
Okay.
I was
30 something.
Yeah, 32 maybe. And she also gradually began to lose her mental capacity. And somehow or another, she got the idea that she and I were married.
Wow.
And she would come to the church, and when I would give the invitation, she would come and stand beside me like she was going to welcome the new members. And I would say, Miss Looney, you can't do that. And not to be critical, but she had a very offensive odor about her. She smoked, and she probably didn't bathe regularly. And so she, one day she even brought a cake to my house. I wasn't there, and the kids were there, and she left the cake with them. And they said, now this cake, only Carol, that's my wife, only Carol is to eat this cake. I don't want any of you, and sure don't let Brother Nick eat any. So, of course, we threw it away. We probably should have had it analyzed.
Yeah, sure.
May have had poison in it. I don't know.
Yeah. Wow.
But it was quite a experience. And she would just, by that time, they'd had answering machines, but they were the little tape in them, and people could leave a message, and she would call and just fill the tape completely full, just her undying love for me. And then she even changed her name. She went to the Social Security and somehow or another claimed that her name was now Harris.
Oh, my goodness.
And it was pretty confusing. And it just getting worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
And then we got this call to this church out here. I said, let's go to Texas.
Oh, wow.
That's probably not the greatest motivation. But we also felt God's call in it. But but we did not mind leaving Miss Looney.
Wow.
And so, of course, when we got out here, again, this was in 1982, I think, and 1983. And we had a great ministry here for 28 years.
For sure.
Of course, you were one of the first people I met.
Yeah.
and you were working at Toadaway.
Yep.
And we came in there, and I don't remember exactly when it was that I felt an impression in my heart to kind of mentor you and see if I couldn't. I've always looked for somebody that I could kind of disciple, and
I'm forever grateful for that day.
So
and
then of course we needed the janitor, the custodian at the church had quit.
Yep.
We needed somebody to do the cleaning, and we
was
called
me.
you to do that.
Yep.
And
That's right.
so that gave me a lot of opportunity to spend time with you.
Mm-hmm.
And then you went from that. Our youth pastor left.
Yep.
And we needed a youth pastor, so you moved from custodian to youth pastor.
Right.
And then from that to kind of associate pastor.
Yeah. A variety of roles in between there.
Of roles, a whole lot of different things.
Yeah.
And then in the midst of that, you began to take an interest in my youngest daughter.
That's correct.
And I was homeschooling her there at the church. And I would, from time to time, ask if you could take her out and throw the Frisbee or something like that, some PE.
I was happy to.
And you were more than happy to.
That's right.
And during that time, I had no awareness of it. I was just clueless, you know. Of course, you're a few years older than she is, so it never entered my mind that an interest was developing. But it was with her too.
Right.
And she didn't say anything to me about it. But her 16th birthday, she said, "Daddy, you know what I want for my 16th birthday?" I said, "What?" She said, "I'd like to have a car and a boyfriend." I said, "Well, I can
maybe one of those.
I can probably get you a car." And then I think it was I was doing I had a counseling office down in Austin, and I would go down there, and I had a radio broadcast down there too on Saturdays. And you asked if you could go with me one Friday and Saturday.
Took a lot of courage to ask, but
so
I did.
We did. I again had no idea what was on your mind, and on the way back, I kept feeling like that you'd been wanting to talk to me about something.
Yep.
And on the way back, you said, I think I even asked you, was there something you were wanting to talk to me about?
Mm-hmm.
And you said, yeah, I was just wondering if I could maybe date your daughter. Well, I assumed you were talking about my older daughter.
Right, right.
And I thought, well, I don't think she's interested. And then you said, well, no, I'm talking about Heather.
Yeah.
And I think I may have run off the road. I'm not sure. But
You didn't.
I
You
said,
didn't.
that's a surprise. And so I came home, talked to my wife about it. She almost fainted too, you know. But then we said we thought that'd be okay. That you could come over to the house on. Of course, you came over to the house on Saturday nights to fold bulletins and all this kind of stuff.
I was already involved in your life at the church, and I'd already been a part of the stuff at your house, youth events, and
right. And
family
I had
events.
known you for probably 5 years by that time,
at least,
And so that's how it started.
Yeah, that's how it all started.
Yeah, and we've never regretted it.
Not a bit, not a bit. Grateful for all those days.
Thrilled.
And I'm sure here in Ovilla, there are stories that were fun too. The thing is, some of those people are still living.
Yeah, that's true. That's
still
true.
around.
That's right. Well, you know, some of the funniest things that have happened in my ministry have happened at baptisms,
Yes,
and at weddings,
yes,
and at funerals.
At funerals,
strangely enough, you know. But I remember one funeral that I was preaching for a man named Fine Jones. He was a member here and I didn't even know he'd been in the military, but we were out at Little Bethel Cemetery, and I was thumbing in my Bible, turning over to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and I heard some noise behind me. It said, hey, and I did not know that it was 7 men with guns, and all of a sudden, those 7 guns fired at one time. And I threw my Bible. It went up in the air. Thankfully, I caught it as it came back down. And of course, they fired 2 more times, but I was prepared for it at that time. But that first time, it scared me to death. And of course, it totally broke up the solemnity of the service because everybody thought it was so funny that I had jumped so hard and thrown my Bible up in the air. But
that's crazy.
And
baptisms,
yeah. I've for me, what the funniest thing that happened to me personally,
right?
I was baptizing a guy when I was at Daniel-dale.
Okay.
He was about 6'8" and just a tall string bean of a guy. And when he started down into the water, he tripped on the top step, and he just fell just like a tree, and I just kind of jumped back out of the way, and I just said, "In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit," and just pushed him under. And then but that was the funniest thing.
Wow.
But now, the funniest baptism story that I know about, though, and this didn't happen to me, thankfully, but it did happen to a man back in Tennessee. He was baptized in a woman who was very scared of the water. He had talked to her for weeks about trying to be calm and everything, and she was rather heavy, and so he finally got her to where she would do it, and she came down into the water, and he started to put her back under the water, and she panicked. She started kicking her foot, and she kicked her foot, her leg, out over the glass. Her leg was hanging out over the glass,
the front
edge of the baptistry, and of course he couldn't raise her up because her leg was pushing there, and she couldn't get her leg loose. And so he thought, I've got to get better leverage.
Yeah.
So he squatted down to get better leverage.
Get up under her.
And when he did, the top of his waders went under the surface of the water, and whoosh, his waders just filled up with water. And here he was. He had her by the head, really. Had her head up above the water. She's screaming, and she still can't get her leg out, and he's hollering,
he
help,
can't move at
help,
all.
Help.
Oh, no.
So that's
wow.
A great ministry for the deacons to come and rescue the pastor. When that song, Rescue the Parachute, they came and fulfilled that.
That was
song.
it.
So that was a lot of fun. And then, of course, at weddings, there are people who faint. You know, I've done about 500, a little over 500 weddings.
So crazy.
And so not all of them, but in fact, the second wedding I ever did, the groom fainted, and we got him up and washed his face and everything. We started over again. We got into the service a minute or two, and he fainted again.
Oh, my word.
So we ended up having to get a chair, and he had to sit in the chair.
Wow.
And we should have gotten one for the bride, too, because, looking back on it, it was rather inappropriate looking
awkward.
At him sitting down, her standing up. And do you take this poor guy to be here? But anyway, they're still married.
Wow. Well, good. That's good.
It's been 60 years.
Yeah.
They're still married.
Wow.
And, in fact, the first 2 couples I married are still married.
Hey, that's good. That's good.
And but I was performing a wedding up in Oregon for David York.
Okay.
You know David.
Yeah.
And several of the people from here had gone up, and Justice Kerr had gone to be. He was in the wedding.
Okay.
And during the wedding, Justice just passed out.
Oh, my
word. Fainted, and he didn't collapse. He fell. He just fell straight backwards.
Oh.
And I was afraid he was severely hurt, but
wow.
I mean, he was more embarrassed than hurt. But and Justice, if you're listening to this, I'm sorry. Probably should have got your permission to tell it. But I know you remember it.
Yeah, yeah.
And but I've had lots of people get sick and throw up.
Oh, in a wedding.
In a wedding.
Yeah.
And I don't know why people get so nervous.
Well, and there's one I remember being a part of when the whole transition of the ring into your hand was problematic.
Well, usually I ask the best man, just lay the ring right in the palm of my hand.
Yeah.
But for some reason, he stuck it in between my fingers. And so I couldn't quite
leverage
get
it because you're holding your Bible with one hand, so you've got to figure
I'm trying to
figure it out.
And then I dropped the ring.
Oh,
and there was a vent right under me, and I knew if it fell down in that vent, and so I tried to catch it. I slung my hand around, and I did hit it, but I didn't catch it, and it just kind of
went off.
So
wow.
Anyway, it was again, that adds a little levity to some serious moments.
Yeah, it does.
So those are some of the things. I don't know.
They're great.
There's so many others. I don't know. We've done some musicals, and a lot of times funny things happen at musicals. I know Jesus partially ascended.
Ooh, yes, and came back down.
And he came back down.
Yeah, that's awkward.
We were doing the Passion Play,
right.
and at the very end, he goes up and he comes back down. And so everybody, what do we do? So
the end.
And I guess I thought that was the second coming.
That's it. That's right. He's back already.
Yeah. So. But a lot of funny things happen, and I'm thankful for it because it does break up some of the somberness and the seriousness, and then of course just great friends that you develop over the years. And every church that I've pastored, of course, those early churches, that first little mission, I'm sure none of them are still living, and even the second church that I pastored, I think probably all the adults that were in the church then have passed, but I still have a lot of memories and then a lot of good things.
Well, faith is obviously serious, and dealing with salvation and a holy God is serious. But the thing I've seen over the years is that by allowing there to be room for some laughter along the way, it shows the reality of life and being real.
Exactly.
Even in especially in the pulpit, and especially as the pastor, that breaks down walls for people. It helps them see, okay, this man is real, and this truth is real, and it develops trust. It develops authenticity that leads to even greater trust. So, I've seen that. I've seen God bless you as a result of that, and
it has been a blessing. That's for sure.
Yeah, all the people that I've known that know you and have been under you as you've been their pastor have said the thing I appreciate most is his authenticity. I know he's real. So I think allowing for humor and comedy along the way and tears along the way, along with truth, is what speaks powerfully to people. So thank you for stories today. Funny stories. I
appreciate the opportunity to share
from the ministry. Yeah. So thank you for everybody joining us today. It's part of lifting them up and living them out. Sometimes involves, again, serious moments, sometimes some tears, but sometimes some laughter. Thank you, Brother Nick.